Terrorism financing is direct financing of activities that have the goal of making terrorism possible. This is a more incremental process. You contribute to a sort of a polarization and you set up the hearts and minds of people.
Terrorism financing can be as simple as providing the monetary means to purchase weapons intended for a terrorist attack. But should we worry about other forms of financing in the context of PCVE? Iran Policy Support BBC looked into this question and found that subtle financial strategies are increasingly used to support radicalization processes in Europe. That's why experts now focus on the issue of undesirable foreign funding, commonly known as UFF. Later on, in this episode, we will delve into the definition of UFF and look at how member states are tackling this issue. Welcome to Radicalisation Unpacked, a podcast by the Iran Policy Support Network exploring best practices to prevent and counter violent extremism. My name is Evi Chiori. Today, on Radicalisation Unpacked, how member states collaborating in the field of PCVE leads to a better understanding of the impact of undesirable foreign funding on European societies.
My name is Charles Revis. I'm the head of the international desk at the Ministry of Justice and Security in the Netherlands. I'm part of the National Coordinator for Countering Terrorism and for Security.
There are also propaganda videos, apparently released by ISIS themselves.
Like many European citizens, back in 2012-2013, Charles observed the frightening rise of the Islamic Caliphate or ISIS in the Middle East.
In this footage, an ISIS fighter carrying an automatic rifle...
All those youngsters joining ISIS. That really came as a blast in Dutch society.
As Charles looks back at those years, he explains how he and his colleagues were confronted with these new and very powerful forms of radicalization. Even then, it was evident that something was different in the way new recruits were identified and enticed to join the movement.
We had a strong feeling that these were not only organized but also financed by countries that had a political incentive to stir up their communities within the Western world. Notably, countries from the Gulf states that financed directly mosques or other places of worship in the Netherlands. It was such a discussion that a parliamentary committee was tasked in sort of finding out what this exactly entailed. That committee was set up in 2019.
After a year of fact-finding and analysis, the parliamentary committee proved that there had indeed been cases where direct financing from the Gulf countries contributed to extremism and terrorism in the Netherlands.
I was involved with the aftermath, actually, of the committee when the parliament wanted the government to take some actions. And one of the strands of actions ended up in my office. One of the questions that the parliament also asked us to do was reach out to other countries within the European Union and come up with a plan to tackle this at an EU level.
The reason behind the requests to reach out to other member states makes sense in a European context. With the EU's free movement of capital, only transnational solutions would be effective. In fact, any malign foreign agent financing extremism in a given country could easily circumvent national legislation by targeting another member state and then exploit the free circulation of capital within the Union.
We went to see the Commission. We said, listen, this is what was happening in our country. We feel that this is an issue that needs a common approach from the European Union.
Charles was keen to emphasize that the findings of the parliamentary committee pointed to a new phenomenon.
This is actually something very different from terrorist financing. Terrorism financing is direct financing making terrorism possible. This is a more incremental process. You contribute to a sort of a polarization. You set up the hearts and minds of people. And that's when the option of doing this in a PBC came up.
PBC stands for Project-Based Collaboration under the RANS PS project. PBCs are projects led by member states with the support of the Commission to facilitate exchanges and cooperation on priority topics among like-minded member states.
We said, well, listen, this is an excellent topic for a PBC. We can develop a common understanding of what we are dealing with, and possibly we can also sort of kickstart a process of finding solutions to tackle that. So at the end of the French presidency, we had our first meeting. It was in May 2022.
The PBC delivered two main outcomes. First, it produced an overview of the existing legal frameworks in the EU in the field of monitoring financial flows from abroad. Second, it enabled the member states to agree on a shared definition of undesirable foreign funding.
We had quite an extensive session on just the word undesirable, because undesirable is actually the best way to frame it. It is not illegal, it is not forbidden, but it contributes to problematic behavior, thus becoming undesirable.
The PBC has been influential in changing the perspective on the role some civil society organizations can play in the radicalization process.
One of the things that it also triggered was NGOs can actually engage in activities under the flag of democratization, but actually, in the practice, these activities may go run completely contrary to our core values. For example, within the idea of promoting freedom of speech, they would actually promote hate speech, for example, subsidized by our countries or by the European Union. So it also sparked that thinking as well. Listen, we need to enhance transparency within the European Union with regard to subsidies given to non-governmental organizations.
Joana de Deus Pereira is Senior Research Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI for short, and she specializes in counterterrorism and PCV. Joana was at the heart of the research conducted by the PBC on undesired foreign funding, working closely with Charles. We reached out to her to discuss in greater detail the key traits of undesirable foreign funding and the challenges involved in addressing it. Joana, welcome to our podcast.
Hello, good morning.
So, what is undesirable foreign funding?
Well, undesirable foreign funding refers to direct and indirect financial flows from foreign states. These fluxes are not inherently illegal, but the destination of the funds may be illegal. They aim to exert malign influence on European societies, and we refer to it very simplistically to the financing flows that are aimed to support extremism and radicalization.
And what are the potential risks of foreign funding of organizations in the EU?
Well, in the EU, we have a very robust legislation and regulatory framework already, for example, to tackle and to counter terrorism financing. The problem is that in between, especially in between terrorist attacks in Europe, several radical and extremist organizations have continued to strive, and they have been growing and expanding because they had the financial means to do it.
And is undesirable foreign funding, or UFF, limited to religious organizations, or has it evolved with current events?
At the beginning, it was requested from the Commission that we zoomed in to the Gulf countries and to some organizations that were linked to a specific religion, because the threat and the alerts were very strong under this umbrella. But we discovered that it was much bigger than only about religious organizations. It was about, for example, bookshops and books who had, I would say, different ideas or ideas against what is accepted and regulated under EU law that could, for example, go against acquired rights. So some cases were identified in some EU member countries, for example, of doctors that agreed on passing virginity certificates to allow marriages within certain communities. This was a problem, but we also identified, for example, school textbooks with narratives, for example, regarding the creation of the world. So we had a bit of everything. At the beginning, it was mainly about the training of imams, for example. There was awareness that there was a problem, and UFF is born out of this awareness. The point with UFF is that it can navigate across several countries, and it is transborder and transnational by nature. So I would say that this is the main key aspect and also the key concern that led DG Home to explore this very particular topic, because not even the label undesirable foreign funding existed. And the research also allowed to give a materialization of the threats.
And Joana, you've been talking about a threat, but how can undesirable foreign funding potentially contribute to radicalization of a country's population?
Well, the problem with UFF is that we are still trying to understand when the money becomes a threat. So I mentioned at the beginning that we are talking about financial fluxes that can be direct or indirect that are not illegal. The problem is that when this money is applied in extremist or radical organizations or promoting the activities of these organizations, it becomes a threat. And this can become a threat for two reasons. Obviously, for the financing, the object destination of the money, but also because we are talking about financial fluxes that do not have a regulatory framework. So they will always be categorized or identified as something that is not really what UFF is. So you have here two different aspects that are very concerning.
And you mentioned religion earlier. So how does foreign funding impact the autonomy of religious and non-religious organizations?
I think before talking about autonomy, we need and we must talk about transparency. So this is about developing more mechanisms that allow for more transparency, even in the financing of religious communities. In one of the research outputs that we produced, we tried to basically identify if there were any mechanisms trying to control this type of fluxes to religious communities. In Belgium, for example, the state pays a subvention to all the religious communities. In a certain way, this is already a kind of mechanism of transparency. But for example, if you go to Germany, or even to Sweden, you have church tax. And what happens here is that it's not applied equally to all religious communities. So what happens is you have communities that are in a certain way controlled even via the taxes, and you have other communities that are obliged, for example, to resort to other types of funding or donations that you do not control. Some countries realized that there were enormous quantities of money circulating from donations that they didn't control. And this calls for some action regarding transparency. Is that money, for example, to pay salaries? Is that money to do conservation works in churches, mosques, or synagogues? What is the money for? And with these large quantities of money circulating across Europe, and in particular in some countries, there were some alerts and some concerns that this money could be used to other purposes, specifically extremism and radicalization.
Should organizations disclose the sources of their funding to ensure transparency? And would it be enough?
Well, there is no perfect mechanism. We have already some member states where the laws were altered to have, for example, certain thresholds regarding donations and the obligation to declare it publicly and to control accounts, for example. It doesn't solve everything, but it will help at least to have a clear idea of how much you're talking about and the purpose of the money.
So what measures are member states taking to prevent foreign funding from being used to promote extremism?
Okay, so we have a group of EU member states that have already started their own internal discussions and also modifications in their national regulatory framework to tackle UFF. Most of the mechanisms of the countries who have already inserted it in the law are always related to transparency, to registering of accounts, registering of names, for example, if you pass a certain threshold.
And should member states regulate foreign funding?
I think there are many threats that are not visible. And we cannot wait. And when I say we, I say European Union. We cannot wait for a tragedy to happen to regulate. The point with UFF is that it can be, if designed and if included in the regulation correctly, a very powerful tool on the preventive side. So if we move towards a regulation that includes UFF at EU level, and let me be clear, on this aspect. We are a little bit far from that point. I think it would be a very powerful tool if included under the Prevent pillar.
And would you say that regulating foreign funding could risk impeding freedom of speech and religious freedom?
Well, that's a question that often comes to our discussion. If we talk about hate speech, the limits between hate speech and freedom of expression is very, very thin. So there is always a concern regarding that aspect that you mentioned. But one thing that we cannot do is disregard that there is a threat. So on my side, I'm offering evidence-based research to the policymakers for them to have more clarity regarding what the threat is. It's in their hands to overcome and to balance this problem.
Well, thank you very much for this insightful interview.
Thank you for the invitation.
So with this, we've come to the end of our fourth and last episode of Radicalisation Unpacked, a podcast by the RAM Policy Support Network exploring best practices to prevent and counter violent extremism. You can find more information on research on undesirable foreign funding and influence in our show notes and on the RAM Policy Support Wiki. I am Evie Chiori, thank you for tuning in, and until next time.